talk is attempt to defend two theses. And so the first one is what I'm going to call my weak thesis. So on this thesis, objective grounds cannot be the full grounds explaining why one's entering into a genuine committed relationship is rational. All right, so what do I mean by this? Well, I'm not going to define what a genuine committed relationship is for you because I think this would beg the question. But just imagine paradigm cases in your own life. So perhaps your relationship with your spouse, perhaps you have a best friend, maybe you have a favorite child. All right, think of those relationships. All right, what do I mean by objective grounds? So I'm going to give you a brief taxonomy. And so these are grounds for why an act is rational. So think about potential explanations for why an act someone performs might be rational. And so what I want to do first here is contrast objective grounds with what I call agent-relative grounds. All right, so the thing that's crucial about objective grounds is that they're sort of universal, they apply to everyone. We might think of these as categorical rules, all right? So these are the type of explanation that goes into why an act might be rational. And so here are some examples. You might think that general moral principles, so for example, Kant's categorical imperative counts as this sort of objective ground. Maybe if you're like Aristotle and you have an objective list theory on what makes someone's life go well, maybe this sort of objective list also counts as this type of objective ground, right? We can contrast this with agent-relative grounds. So these are going to be situational facts about the agent. So for example, perhaps I like ice cream. This is the sort of fact about me that would make it rational for me to eat ice cream, all things being equal. And so the thing about these agent-relative grounds is that when you hold fixed the facts, what it's going to be rational for any agent occupying that role or that situation to do is going to be the same. So there's a supervenience relation between these agent-relative facts and what it's rational for any agent in that position to do, all right? And then so some examples of what might count for this are perhaps circumstances, so like the circumstance you're in as an agent. Maybe your desires, your motivations, your dispositions, or your beliefs, all right? Let's see. All right, so now that we know what objective grounds are, it should be apparent that this weak thesis is obviously true. So at least in the case of persons, right? So I'm friends with Liz. It's not like there's some sort of universal rule saying that everyone should be friends with Liz. Well, maybe that'd be nice for Liz. Right? It's something about me and like my facts and how they relate to Liz. All right. So then the second thesis I want to defend is a stronger thesis. All right, so this is a strong thesis. It entails the weak thesis, but I think it's a little more controversial. So according to my strong thesis, objective and agent-relative grounds cannot be the full grounds explaining why one's entering into a genuine committed relationship is rational. All right, so you might be thinking, well, what other grounds could there be? Maybe we've exhausted all the grounds. But I want to say that we have not, and there is at least one more type of grounds that's relevant to explanations. And so these are what I want to call first personal grounds, all right? And so the thing that's distinctive about first personal grounds is that they involve an exercise of agentive power. So they involve a sort of willing, all right? And then there's a sort of up to you-ness about them. So for example, suppose I'm considering whether to be friends with Liz, and any agent that occupies my role would have the same sorts of objective and agent-relative reasons. There's still a sort of up to you-ness in my decision to be friends with Liz. You might think that just because I'm in a situation relating to Liz, that doesn't mean that I have to be friends with her, right? So we like to think that who you pick as your friends is optional. Another way of thinking of this is that historical duplicates can rationally differ. So imagine a counterpart of me in a world that's historically similar, right? And so we're leading up to this point where I'm deciding whether to be friends with Liz. It seems plausible that the two duplicates can rationally differ in whether or not they decide that they want to be friends with Liz. All right, examples of this. So these are going to be acts of will. And then in the literature, so you don't think I'm crazy, I'm not just making up this new category. So this has played a prominent role in some literature recently. So the most The first thing that you might think of is voluntarism or voluntarist reason. So both Chang and Korsgaard think that by willing, you can create reasons. So Korsgaard thinks that you can create reasons ex nihilo for you to do something. Chang thinks that you can strengthen existing reasons and that the additional strength is the result, or it's grounded in an act of willing. All right. And then as we move on, you'll see more examples of how this sort of ground arises. Okay, so now that we've got the two theses, let me briefly mark how this is going to connect to faith. So what I'm going to say is that the additional grounds needed for a full explanation in why your act is rational is the marker of faith, all right? And so what I'm interested in is the connection between acting faithfully and acting rationally. All right, so now that we've got the two theses on the table and how this is supposed to connect with faith, let me give you a brief overview of the rest of the talk. So first I'm going to start with some data. And so these are just going to be observations about relationships that we observe in the world. So I'll talk about types of relationships and then features of committed relationships. Then we'll try to explain the data. And so the explanation we're interested in is why it's rational for people to commit to these sorts of relationships or enter into them. And so, in case you haven't guessed, I'm going to argue that first personal grounds must be part of the explanation. Then we'll shift to our relationship with God. So on a lot of monotheistic conceptions, God is a personal being, right? And we want a personal relationship with God. So I'm going to be interested in the question of whether a relationship with God is analogous to a relationship with a human person. And then finally, we'll circle back to faith and talk about the connection between acting faithfully and acting rationally. All right, so the data. So here are some types of committed relationships, and these are the sorts of things that I have in mind. So first, there's friendship. You might think there are romantic bonds. And then you might think there are familial bonds. And with the family bonds, we have to be careful because I think that because families are so close and there are often obligations that arise from reciprocation or from reliance, there's going to appear to be additional like family bonds or family obligations. But I'm going to say that those can apply to anyone you happen to stand in that relationship with. So I want to maintain that there's nothing particularly special about familial bonds, or at least nothing that couldn't in principle apply to someone who you're not related to. There might be other things to which one might stand in a committed relationship. I'm open to that. So for example, maybe your relationship with animals, or maybe a commitment to ideals. We can talk about these in the Q&A if you want. For the most part, I'll be focused on interpersonal relationships. All right, so here are some observations about the features of the relationships we're interested in. The first is that there's temporal extension. So there's a starting point and then it continues in the future. It's possible that it might build up over time. So maybe you know the person and you interact and your commitment slowly builds through time. All right. I think that probably, though I'm not super committed to this, it's got to be extended through time. It'd be weird if you had a friendship where you're like, it's going to end at T2. Exactly at T2, we're not friends anymore, right? Okay, another key feature is what I'm calling optionality. So this is the up to you-ness about relationships, all right? So it's not like there's a requirement by rationality that you be friends with any particular person. Connected to the up to you-ness is a sort of underdetermination, all right? So oftentimes it's going to happen to be the case that your reasons for being friends or being in a relationship with a person are roughly on balance. So like the reasons for entering and the reasons against it are going to be on a par. Okay. Let's see. Relationships often tend to give you additional obligations or reasons that you wouldn't have if you weren't in the relationship. So here's a couple of examples. So first, imagine that Harry needs a kidney, all right? And so suppose Harry's a stranger. You probably don't have an obligation to give Harry your kidney. But suppose Harry is your spouse or your child or your friend, then it seems like you do have an obligation or perhaps at least a reason to give Harry your kidney that you wouldn't have if you weren't in this relationship with Harry, all right? Here's another example. So suppose I'm trying to decide what color to paint my living room. Liz is my roommate, and I know that she really likes the color purple. So now I have an additional reason to consider painting the living room purple, even though before, like, if Liz was not my roommate and I didn't care about her preferences, it seems like I would have absolutely no reason to want to paint my living room purple. Okay. In some cases, it seems that relationships or being in a relationship also allows you to go against reason. And so I think here I probably have more in mind epistemic reasons. So let's see. It might be permissible, I'm not sure, you can push me on this, but it might be permissible to enter into relationships even if it would be slightly irrational if you like counted up the objective and agent relative grounds to enter into that relationship. So for example, maybe you're interested in this person who is not particularly wealthy, maybe they have some pretty significant flaws, but for whatever reason, you just want to be in a relationship with them. It might not be completely irrational, like perhaps it is permissible, like rationally speaking, to enter into this relationship with them. Think about promising to maintain a commitment. So oftentimes you might have evidence that it will be extremely difficult for you to maintain your commitments to other people. It may even turn out to be the case that if you look at the whole of the evidence, like maybe you look at the divorce rate and see that it's projected that about 50% of people will get divorced in their lifetime, right? Maybe you have evidence that shows you that it would be very difficult to maintain this commitment, and so when you make the commitment, you're either going against evidence, so you're acting irrationally, or you're doing it irresponsibly, right? You're promising someone something even though you have doubts about, like significant doubts about whether or not you'll be able to carry this out. But it seems like it's okay to do this in relationships. So it's okay to promise to commit your life to someone when you get married. This might also enable you to maintain belief, or maybe maintain the way you act towards the person in the face of some sorts of counter evidence. So imagine that your friend tells you that your spouse is cheating on you. It may be the case that it's rationally permissible for you to maintain your belief in your spouse's fidelity, or for you to not, like, I don't know, divorce your spouse, even if the evidence is strong. I have no idea. But the point here is that it may be permissible to act a certain way even in light of evidence to the contrary. Okay, so now that we've thought about this, let's think about why we might be in a committed relationship, or rather why it would be rational to be in one. So let's think about whether objective grounds can explain this. So are there moral rules, for example, that make it rational to commit with a relationship to someone? And so as I've already suggested, this answer is obviously no. But even if there were, what I want to say is that these grounds are not sufficient to capture what's genuine about relationships, all right? I think this might be easier to see in the case when we add agent-relative grounds, all right? So this is more promising because there's contrast. So my agent-relative grounds might give me reason to be friends with Liz, but maybe not as good of friends with Trent because he lives further away. But this still won't capture the genuineness. So think about that Simpsons episode where they're giving out Valentine's Day's cards. I think that the choosing is very significant in explaining what it is that's genuine about a relationship, right? So it's not just that the person will make you happier, or maybe that you have shared interests. It's that you choose to be in a relationship with that person. It's something you do that makes that relationship genuine, all right? You might compare this to actions. So compare the case involving objects to the case involving persons. So perhaps there's an objective rule that says what I should do is maximize my happiness, and then there's this agent-relative fact about me that I like ice cream, and so I go and I eat ice cream. So I've acted rationally, but there's nothing like particularly special about the way I've acted towards this ice cream, right? Now imagine the analogous human case. So perhaps it's objectively good for me to have friends, right? Maybe Aristotle's right. And then due to agent-relative facts about me, Liz is a particularly good candidate. For me to just be like, all right, Liz, let's do stuff together, but in a very impersonal way, and for me to go, oh, Liz, let's do stuff together because it would be rational for me to do so. There seems to be something sort of non-ideal or disingenuous about this, right? What we would want is for me to be like, Liz, I would really like for you to be my friend, and in fact, I've made this decision that I want to be in a friendship with you, all right? Imagine getting married to a person and standing at the altar and for your vows, listing all of the age and relative facts about you that makes this relationship make sense. That's not what's going on there. What's going on is that you're making a choice to be committed to the person. That's what makes the relationship genuine. All right, so what are the remaining options if the objective and age and relative grounds aren't enough? Well, first, you might think that when we enter into these relationships, we're just being irrational or irrational. So if it's irrational, reason doesn't tell us one way or the other. And so that would capture the optionality. Or you might just think it's irrational, like it's irrational to be in these relationships. So the problem is we don't typically think we're being irrational or irrational when we enter into friendships or marriage. Option 2 is that we add another type of ground. And so these are the first personal grounds, all right? Okay, so here's the nice benefits of adding the first personal grounds. So what they might allow us to do is to rationally decide in the cases of underdetermination. And so here I directly have in mind Chang's idea that when two options are on a par and this is a major life decision for you, what you do is you will that one of these options seems to matter more, and so in doing so, you make it rationally the case, all right? This also explains how we have new reasons or obligations when we enter into these relationships, because what you're doing is that as part of the commitment is you're taking the other person's interests to be reasons for yourself, whereas they wouldn't have been before. Let's see. Also, this might explain why you can rationally decide to undergo personal transformation. So, personally transformative experiences are ones in which your core preferences change and what it's like to be you changes. All right, and so if you're Lori Paul, you might think there's a problem with this. How can you rationally decide to become someone when you don't know what that person is like? And so what she thinks is necessary is a sort of decision to discover what it will be like to be you in this relationship. All right, and so it's the decision that's the first personal aspect. And then we've talked about the acting against the evidence. So for example, promising even though it seems difficult. This might even connect to the Jamesian will to believe. So you've got some evidence and then you're allowed to meet it halfway. And so that meeting of it halfway is something that you do. All right, so to recap, here's the 4 potential explanations. I've argued that 4 is the best, and so that we should think first personal grounds are part of the explanation. So now let's talk about God. Do we think that God is analogous to the case of persons? Well, if you think yes, then you agree with me, and we can just end this talk. But you might say no, so let's think about why we might say that. So here's this analogy. You might think there's an epistemic gap between our confidence that God exists and our confidence that other people exist. And so the thought might be, well, how can you enter into a relationship with something if you're not sure that it exists, right? So I don't actually think that's true. So first, I think that you can continue your commitments to people after they cease to exist. So you might think of carrying out a person's last wishes. Perhaps you're not sure if they've ceased to exist, so maybe there's a giant disaster. And it's likely that your friend died in that disaster, but you're not entirely certain. And so you continue doing things that they would have wanted you to do, or you continue acting as if they still exist. And then also, I think maybe it's possible to conditionally commit. So Trent and Ted have some nice cases in their paper on hiddenness where you're not sure if there's another person that exists, but you do things that seem like things you would do if they did exist, like if you were in a relationship with them. So I think maybe it's possible that you could enter into this sort of relationship like conditional on it turning out that they exist, all right? And so actually this is nice because it gives you a weak epistemic requirement, and then we'll see why this is nice for faith. Here's the second disanalogy. You might think that in the case of God, objective grounds fully explain why it's rational for you to seek a relationship. So I think this might be pretty common. So because of like God's perfection, maybe especially his omnibenevolence, also because of the creator-creation relation, we might think that objective grounds make it rational for you to seek the relationship. But I think it's compatible to say that with my weak and strong thesis to grant that objective grounds tell you it's rational, because what we need is the genuineness. All right? So objective grounds just aren't enough to capture this genuineness. Again, think about the Valentine's Day card where you choose the person. And you might contrast this to Pascalian reasoning. So if I decide that I want to be in a relationship with God just because it's going to benefit me, I run through the Pascalian wager, right? That's not ideal. It doesn't seem genuine in the right way, right? So what you need is you need the reason that captures your decision to be in the relationship. All right. Here are some virtues of including the first personal grounds. So the first is that it's compatible with the weaker belief component. And why we might want this is because, and this connects to what Dan said yesterday, we want people to be able to have faith even if they aren't certain or don't have a particularly high credence in God's existence. All right? Here's the second virtue, and this one I actually like a lot. It opens up a possibility of a different sort of credit that you get for being faithful. All right? So what you will is up to you, but your circumstances, desires, etc. usually aren't. So your agent-relative facts typically aren't up to you, all right? In the cases where you do think that some of these desires or motivations are up to you, maybe you think you've built them out of habit, what's going on here is that they've been based on the first personal grounds. They've been based in something that you do, all right? So they appear to be agent-relative grounds, but really we care about the more fundamental grounds, which are the first personal ones. And so this allows us to have credit for committing to these sorts of relationships. It gives us credit for being faithful. All right? Okay, so let's finish up with connecting faith and rationality. So if the strong thesis is true, and I hope I've convinced you that it is, then either there are no grounds explaining the rationality of genuine committed relationships, or we want these first personal grounds. All right? So faith has to do with our relationship with God, and we want this relationship to be one of these genuine committed relationships. And so what I want to propose is that the presence of first personal grounds is going to be a marker of faith. And so I think something like this is probably true, though we can play around with it in Q&A. So I think that X acts faithfully with respect to P, where P is a person, if and only if X's act is done in virtue of X's being genuinely committed to P. And then, of course, being genuinely committed to P requires the first personal grounds. All right? If it did turn out that these first personal grounds didn't exist, and I'm right that the strong thesis is true, then I guess we also have another interesting consequence, which is that acting faithfully would be irrational or irrational. But I think that plausibly acting faithfully can be rational, and what we need for it to be rational to act faithfully are the first person grounds. All right. And then again, the two virtues of my view is that we can rationally act faithfully even without belief, and we can get credit for our faithful acts. All right. So that is it. Thanks. Forward back.
Forward back.
Okay. Forward
Do
back.
I need a mic?
Yeah.
Same mic? Wait, I don't have a pocket. Oh.
You can clip it into your pants.
Okay.
I can get you like a handicap.
Okay. Sorry. All right, so I'm Liz. Thanks, Becca, for that really awesome presentation. You did a great job. It was really interesting. I like the commitment to ball is life. Yeah. Okay. All right, so first I just wanted to give a quick summary of what Becca said. She had two theses, a weak thesis and a strong thesis. The weak thesis says that objective grounds alone cannot explain why one's entering into a genuine committed relationship is rational. And the strong thesis says that both objective and agent relatives grounds cannot be the full grounds for explaining why one's entering into a genuine committed relationship is rational. Then she talked about first personal explanations, and she said that given our data about some kinds of relationships, we needed these first personal explanations to explain genuine committed relationships. And she then argued that this also applies to our relationship with God. And first personal explanations are an important part of understanding faith, both in God and in other people. So that's kind of a nutshell of her presentation. So I have a few comments. The first one is actually just a comment. But I thought there might be some sort of asymmetry between the thinnest explanation one might want to offer for why it's rational to be in a genuine relationship with God versus the thinnest explanation one might offer for why it's rational to be in a genuine relationship with other human persons. So let's say you're like a really strong internalist. You might think that all you need is the agent-relative grounds to be rational to commit to other people. However, I think most people are going to think there's some sort of universality or objective reason why people should be in a relationship with God. And so you might think that the thinnest explanation for why one might need to be in a relationship with God is actually the objective grounds. So I thought this was interesting when thinking about her weak thesis, because depending on whether we're talking about God or other people, it's going to be more or less controversial. So that was just kind of like a comment. But this actually doesn't affect her strong thesis. So my second comment, so she argued, one of the big parts of her argument was that genuineness can't be captured by objective explanations or by first personal grounds, but I think depending on how we construe the cases, this might not be as intuitive. So thinking just about our relationship with God. So let's say I decide to enter it because of some objective fact about God's character, he's awesome, he's amazing, or because I think because of something about me, there's a good reason I would want to be in a relationship with him, right? I don't think these necessarily have to be selfish reasons, so I don't think that either agent, relative, or objective reasons are necessarily selfish. And so I think just depending on how we think about the explanation, it could capture the genuineness. So that's my second comment. So my third comment is I think near the end when she talked about faith, she suggested that first personal explanations might be necessary for faith. At least faith entails a genuine commitment, and a genuine commitment entails the first person explanations. But it might be odd to think that if we don't have these first person explanations, then faith is impossible. And you might think these first person explanations are kind of spooky or weird. At least this was sort of my initial reaction. I might want to try to explain genuine committed relationships without them. I also wanted to note, let's say you think these first person explanations are sort of spooky or weird. I think her strong thesis is actually compatible with there being some kind of fifth ground. I don't know what this would be. Maybe you guys could come up with something in the Q&A. But that makes an act rational, so we don't need first person explanations. Because she just said that objective and agent relative grounds aren't enough, but maybe we could come up with something else to explain them, these relationships. So maybe we don't need the spooky first person explanations. Finally, I guess my last comment was more of a question for Becca. Are first person explanations required to explain the rationality of committing to any genuine relationship? And she talked a lot about like underdetermination cases, but what about close cases where, it's like maybe I should commit, maybe I shouldn't, but eventually one reason's going to outweigh the other, or some kind of crazy landslide case where you obviously shouldn't commit. So I put on there like having a committed relationship with the devil. So you might worry, depending on how much work the first person explanations are doing, you could like conjure up all this like active will to like be rational to commit to a relationship with the devil. But we might want to say like, no one should be in a relationship with the devil. That's clearly irrational and wrong and something you shouldn't do. So I was just wondering like how far do these go and in what cases do they apply? So, yeah, that's it. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Oh, should I give the mic back to her? Okay.
go with that. All right, so first, thank you, Liz, for your comments. They're super helpful. So here are my responses. So first, with respect to comment 1, I think I'm potentially okay with saying that the case of God and persons are different, because in God, you might think the thinnest conception required to be rational and in a relationship is the objective grounds, but in the case of human persons, the thinnest conception involves the agent-relative grounds. Actually, I sort of like this account of why there appears to be a disanalogy between the case of God and the case of people, and then I could still preserve the strong thesis and argue that we still need the first personal grounds. Let's see. With respect to comment 2, I don't want to say that, so let's see. I don't think it's the selfishness that's the issue, although normally it's okay to act out of self-interest. I guess if you were acting purely out of self-interest, that might be a vice or something. But what I want to preserve is that the thing that makes something genuine is the choice, or the thing that you do. Okay, comment 3 was about whether first personal grounds even exist. These seem like weird, spooky things, right? And so I do admit that I think that this was one of the more controversial parts of my talk. And in some sense, I'm sort of making an appeal to authority. I'm saying, look, Chang, Korsgaard, and Paul all hold something like this. They can't be completely crazy. Well, I do want to note that we shouldn't think that these are spooky in the metaphysical sense, or we shouldn't think that these are spooky entities in the way that some people think property or numbers are. And why is this? Well, most people think that there are agents that can will, and so an act of will isn't a spooky metaphysical entity. And then what I'm doing is just suggesting that these should be taken into account when we think about why decisions are rational, all right? And then finally, with response to comment 4, I think that this is a really good issue. So I'm definitely okay with using first personal grounds in the case of cases of underdetermination. And I guess I do think it would be bad if we could use it in the landslide cases to make entering into a relationship with the devil a rational thing to do, right? And in fact, so this is one of the issues in the literature on voluntarist reasons. One of the things people object to is that it seems that we can use voluntarist reason if we can just create them ex nihilo. It seems that we can just keep creating them and then eventually have enough reason to do things that just appear incredibly irrational, right? And so I think that there are ways to avoid this while still preserving that there is these first personal grounds. So you might go Chang's route and say that, no, you can't create things ex nihilo. What you can do is you can add additional strength to grounds that already exist. And then the additional strength is had in virtue of you willing it, right? Let's see. And then, so what about the close cases? So these are the ones I'm not too sure of, because I can see how if you allow in the close cases, you end up in a Sorites paradox that gets you to the landslide cases, and I don't want that. But then maybe depending on whose account you go with, so maybe if you think that the person who thinks you can create these reasons ex nihilo or these grounds ex nihilo has a way of blocking the landslide cases, then you could go with that, and maybe if you're creating these new grounds, that's okay in the close cases. But I don't know, so I'd be happy to hear what you guys think about that. Thanks, Liz.